Welcome back. So this is Ghost History Medium, location number 12, Sailor's Snug Harbor in Staten Island, New York. This is the part 2 of the investigation reveal. In this reveal, we're going to talk about underwater telescopes, Colton lights, Civil War and U-boat submarines, the Matron House, and about the woman walking the grounds, and even an 1867 murder of a cook. Then we'll go to Cottage Row and talk a bit about this death on the stairs. Okay, let's start off talking about telescopes, lights, and submarines. So looking back and rewatching this part where I was sitting down in front of the Memorial Chapel and really getting a feel of the individuals that were coming forward that wanted to talk about the place, a lot of them wanted to talk about what they did on the water, which makes sense because they were sailors. But I was wondering, why are they bringing up lights? Why are they bringing up this strange tool that they were using under the water? And who were they looking out for during this time? And, it got me thinking, sailors are known for telling stories, right? They're known for telling tall tales from the ocean, Moby Dick getting eaten by the whale, those kinds of tall tales. And, I wonder if these sailors, these older, polite gentlemen, a younger woman was coming to sit down and talk to them, and these were the stories that they wanted to tell. And I think I have illuminated why they told specifically about this underwater telescope and these lights. And it's because at that same time frame, they were both invented by women, which is an incredible feat to have been done at that time, which is during the Civil War. And, I think they were just being really polite, having a general conversation with me about the ocean, about what they did, and, how are they relating it to someone of this time. Okay, so this is one of the coolest validation pieces of evidence that I think I've ever discovered to date in Ghost History Medium. So when these sailors were talking about this tool that they were using, they were describing this long, black, skinny metal tool that they would poke in the water over the side of the ship, and they would be able to look underwater. Now, okay, that in itself doesn't really seem that special, but they were specifically talking to me about it. I didn't even know this thing existed. Not to mention, when we're talking way back then, I had no idea that this was a thing. Well, it's a thing. And it was invented by a female. Her name was Sarah Mather. It was invented in 1845 as a specifically submarine telescope, an apparatus for examining objects under the surface of the water. Now, in 1864, she upgraded it by adding a lamp at the bottom and was given another patent for that. And it was considered an improvement on her original submarine telescope. And with the beginning of the Civil War, this tool was used to actually detect Confederate underwater activity. And I bet you 1,000% that that's exactly what these sailors were talking about, because they kept talking about an enemy coming in, and I kept wanting to think it felt like it would have been like the Germans in World War I, but this was before World War I. I didn't even know that there were submarines before World War I. Well, in fact, there were submarines all the way back in being used into the Revolutionary War. The first submarine documented is called the Turtle, and it was a one-man ship boat that they used in the New York City harbor. Didn't really actually end up working out very well, but that's the first documented submarine being made. Now, come the Civil War time frame, there's submarines being made on the Confederate side and the Union side, on both sides. The Union side a little bit more success, but the Confederate side definitely was creating these submarines. One of the Confederate submarines was actually recently discovered in 2000. This is called the Hunley, and the Hunley was actually the first submarine to successfully take down a Union ship. Now, shortly after it did that, it actually also sank, and its 8 crew members drowned. So they found it 130 years later, resurfaced it. They've been doing some research. It's now at a museum. So this was the coolest thing. I definitely think they were talking about finding submarines and the bubbles. They're even talking about bubbles. And this picture here shows that they would have a gas line up into the water top that would exchange oxygen for them. So this was actually totally mind-blowing. This is a real thing. It was invented by a female, and I think they were just, again, talking to me about, chatting. They were just kind of chatting it up with me. What do they know? They know some cool things that were made by women. Maybe this strange girl who's coming onto our residential area wants to talk about this. And I certainly did, and it was absolutely fascinating. So the second thing that they were talking to me about on the water were these lights, this kind of like light warning system. And they specifically were talking about white and red lights. Well, here we go again. This is another invention in 1859. This is by Martha Coston, and she invented a night signal flare for the U.S. Army. And she actually used three colors, red, white, and green. This was one of the most successful inventions of the time. Not only that, it saved thousands, and I'm going to say hundreds of thousands of lives. Even on the U.S. Titanic, when it sank, the lights used, and you can see it in the movie, which is interesting that the movie Titanic came up, also with Leonardo DiCaprio. But anyway, in that movie, you can see the lights being used, communicating to other boats of their dire situation. Those lights that were being used and the flare signals that went out were actually from Martha Coston. So it allowed an idea of approaching vessels if it was friend or foe. And this was really, again, important during the Civil War when they didn't know if it was a Confederate boat and they didn't know if it was a Union boat. It's also still used today as a backup system, even on modern ships. So two amazing real-life inventions from women back in the Civil War. I definitely think that these were the two things that these sailors were talking to me about, and I'm so happy that I was able to find them in the history books. Let's revisit the infamous Matron House, some of the rumors about it, a woman walking the grounds, and an 1867 murder of a cook. The Matron House is one of the most notorious buildings for paranormal activity on this property. I didn't know that going into this place, but it was definitely a building that attracted my attention, and I could definitely feel a lot of activity around it. When I went back to do my research, it turns out that other investigations have been done here. Ghost hunters came here in 2011 and filmed this episode of Murdered Matron. And also Ghost Adventures has been here, season 8, episode 12. Another well-known paranormal investigator, Brian Cano, made this wonderful documentary called Haunted Snug Harbor, and it was posted in 2013. It is absolutely fabulous, has wonderful pictures, interviews, really historical documentation of stuff going on, but also in this they talk about the Matron House. The archaeology of the Matron House has been well documented. There was a paper released in 2008 discussing about the purpose of the Matron House, different aspects of the matrons, what they were doing there, and also about the steward and his wife. So the Matron House was a large 2-story brick house with a cellar and an attic. Living quarters were divided into 2 apartments. One was for the steward of the Snug Harbor and his family, so that included children and a wife, while the other side was for single female employees. And these single employees were the ones who were doing laundry, they were doing cooking, they were seamstresses, and they also helped out with the linens. This is a fabulous picture here from that article showing the matron and the female staff. So what I thought was so interesting about this is that they were wearing white blouses and dark dresses, which is exactly what I was describing as part of the help. Now, as you can see the matron sitting here, she's older than the other women, but it is kind of hard to tell their different ages. Now, most of the matrons were supposed to be single, but looking at these women here, some of them were older and they definitely could have still been married and had lives outside of this job. So from 1867 to 1884, between 6 and 13 women were living in the matron cottage, and the number of female employees increased to accommodate the work. And as I described in the first review video, the majority of the individuals who were living here as far as sailors were from the 1880s to about 1900, 1910. That was when it was the biggest maximum capacity. The other thing I wanted to make note here was I saw this woman in the white top and the black skirt walking around and kind of enjoying the gardens in the area. And what I was seeing was that there was more gardens back in the day, that Victorian time frame, than there were today. And this is a really nice note here saying that Thomas Melville, who was one of the governors, added lots of trees, paths, and other landscaping details throughout Snug Harbor. The greenery and open space must have seemed a respite compared to the crowded living conditions for urban factory workers. So you can definitely imagine that one of these women who was working here would really have enjoyed walking around her place of occupation if it had all of this gardening and greenery around. And she may still want to do that in spirit. There's a really bizarre story about the matron in the Matron House, and you can hear this story on some of the haunted tours that Snug Harbor does host. And I heard it over and over again in these Ghost Adventurer and Ghost Hunter episodes. And the story goes that the matron had an affair with a sailor. The sailor and her had an illegitimate child. The illegitimate child they tried to hide and was kept in the basement of the Matron House, locked up. Now, at some point, there was an argument. The matron murdered the father, and then the child got out, and in the child's frustration, the child murdered the matron with a pair of scissors, barehanded with a pair of scissors, and she died. I couldn't find any evidence of this in the newspapers at all. There was absolutely nothing of this nature of a matron being killed or having illegitimate children. Now, it's possible that they covered it up. It is possible, but I will say they didn't cover up the even more scandalous story of the pastor getting shot by an inmate. So I don't know. I couldn't find anything to corroborate it. It's still possible, but it's out there. What I was able to find was this historical event from 1867 where there was a murder of a cook who worked at Sailor Snug Harbor. Her name was Mary Lynch. She was 38 years old and she was found dead on the street in New York City. It's suspected that it was her 19-year-old lover who murdered her. And it also says in this article that Mary Lynch had a bad reputation. I don't really know what that means, but they felt like it was important enough to put into the newspaper article about her murder that she had this bad reputation. So it's possible that this inciting event actually catapulted this kind of legend about this woman who had an illegitimate child and killed him and her, and it's this crazy story. But this was a real murder that happened to somebody who worked there. The other thing that I would say is in our investigations in the past, we have encountered individuals who have either passed away suddenly or unexpectedly. They do tend to come back to their place of work and their place of occupation. So we actually investigated a restaurant where they were complaining of vacuuming sounds and cleaning sounds upstairs. And we made contact with this woman, and it ended up being a worker who had passed away, and she kept coming back to clean the place. So it's possible that this Mary Lynch is coming back to Sailor Snug Harbor to wander the grounds, and maybe somebody will recognize her as being Mary Lynch and not this other really tall tale. This also made me think of all the other individual spirits who worked here over the years. There were butchers, there were doctors, nurses, gardeners, painters, administration, those who worked in the boiler room, linens, dining room. There were so many individuals that made this place function and allowed these sailors to have a wonderful, happy, comfortable home until the end of their days. Lastly, let's finish up visiting Cottage Row and the Death on Stairs. Cottage Row today consists of 5 different cottages in a Victorian style. They were used back in the day to house kind of the upper levels of employment that was there, so the head physician, head gardener, farmer, etc. I could not find anything about these buildings being 2 families, but I could definitely imagine that they were pretty coveted by those who worked here and they would want to have lived in them. Today there are 5 cottages, but I was able to find a map of the place back in 1887, and there were 4 cottages at that time with a steward's resident and a governor's resident. And what was interesting to me was that one of the buildings very close to, it was either the building we were at or the one next to it, is the gardener's building. And that was something that did come to me as far as gardening when we were standing on the steps there. There is again another tall tale or legend about these cottages. If you go for a ghost tour, they will tell you about a man that was drunk who came home and was left out on the stairs, froze to death on the stairs. Again, I didn't know anything about this before doing my walkthrough. Now, the only thing that I could find that could line up with this story was this newspaper article from 1897. It had to do with a drunk man who supposedly possibly murdered his wife, and he may or may not have survived. But it didn't happen at Cottage Row. It actually happened at cottages at Lafayette Avenue and 10th Street, which is a few streets over from Cottage Row. He was a worker from Snug Harbor, and again, we just talked about those individuals who have passed from a sudden event or a traumatic event can come back to continue to work on their property. So it is possible that him and his wife, their energy is now transferred into the only place that's really still available to them that looks like it did back in the day. It's possible, but I'm not so sure about that. Other than this story, I couldn't find anything that had to do with any murders or deaths that had happened on Cottage Row. Does not mean it didn't happen, but I couldn't corroborate it. I was able to find this mention of a man named George Roberts in 1873 who did die at the age of 81 from falling from the outer steps of the institution. Now, the outer steps of the institution are fairly close to where the Cottage Row is, but again, that's kind of a stretch. I kept this in here because I was able to actually find a picture of Roberts George, and it just puts another face to the name of the many individuals who came here in retirement to live out their lives. And I wanted to end with a memorial and a nod to them and their service. Okay, that wraps up for our part 2 investigation reveal of Sailor Snug Harbor. This is a free place to go to. You can walk around. There's many different historical buildings and the Noble Maritime Museum that you can check out. It would be so fascinating if you went and did your own investigation to see if you could find anybody at the Matron House, anybody at the chapel, and anybody at Cottage Row. Good luck and happy hunting.